Hello and welcome to Thursdays on the Stoop, or as it's known this month, What's Next with Penguin Random House and Blue Stoop. I'm Julian, one of two co-directors of Blue Stoop. If you're unfamiliar with us, we're a literary arts organization serving adults in the greater Philadelphia area with classes, workshops, professional opportunities, events, and everything in between. We're so excited to have you here and so excited to have our guests here who are here from Penguin Random House to talk about promoting your book. I'm going to let Libby introduce everyone, but I will put some links in the chat now and at the end of the session where you can give us feedback, find out about other upcoming Blue Stoop events and opportunities, and generally just stay in touch with us because this is just the beginning. If you're new, and if you're not new, this is just a continuation of an already important relationship. So thanks for being here, and Libby, take it away.
Thanks, Julian. Hi all. Anyone who joined us the last 2 weeks, welcome again. We got more panelists, so you'll hear less from me today, but still you're gonna hear a lot from me. My name is Libby Burton. I'm an executive editor at Crown. I work in predominantly nonfiction, do a lot of memoir, some politics, some sort of feminist-minded empowerment books, and some prescriptive stuff as well. So whole gauntlet of stuff. The last 2 weeks we've been discussing first what's an editor do and sort of like what are editors looking for and how does a platform really sort of function in the world of publishing these days. And then last week we talked with some agents about what do agents even do, and like why do you need one, and like when do you need one, and what's their job, and how do they earn 15%. So I'm really excited to sort of conclude this trifecta of panels today with some of my amazing colleagues who both work at Penguin Random House and not looking at you, Whitney, about how promoting a book and sort of putting a book into the world, and how just understanding what that process is like, what the social media landscape is like, and yeah, how do you compete with all the noise out there? So to that end, I will kick it first. We're going to do some introductions, and then I'm going to ask a bunch of questions. If you guys have questions, put it in the chat, but maybe try to leave it to the end because we're going to start doing questions at 4:45, and I don't want them to get lost. But in the meantime, if you want to write what genres you write in the chat, that will sort of just help us inform this discussion so I know what you guys write about. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Gwyneth to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your publishing journey.
Yeah, sure. I'm Gwyneth Stansfield. I'm an executive publicist at Crown. I work with Libby and Chantelle there. And I've been at Crown for several years now, I think 2017. And I do a few different things here. So I am a publicist for a lot of our books that, new books that are being published. And I work one-on-one with those authors and with the whole rest of the book team to find ways to reach readers through media, and just kind of get the word out about the book. And I also work on a couple of other areas here which are related, which is that I also work on some of our backlist, where books have been out for a little while, and there's some reason why we want to kind of keep them front and center in people's minds. And I also work on our serialization, which is basically whenever a media outlet wants to run a short excerpt from your work, that is something that kind of fits with publicity, but for reasons, it's sort of a separate thing in the publishing industry. And so I handle that too for a lot of our books, and that can be a really kind of key part of the whole publicity campaign. Before I came to Crown, I worked at a couple different places. I started out at Simon & Schuster at Scribner, and I worked there for several years, kind of cut my teeth there. And then I worked for a small publisher for a very short time that was a little bit more scrappy. And then I came to Penguin Random House, first at Blue Rider Press, which was a kind of unique imprint within Penguin that sadly is no more. So then I ended up at Crown. So I've been really, really happy to be at PRH for a number of years now, and to be talking with you all today, because promotion is something that, is is kind of a mystery, I think, when you're just coming into publishing your work. And it's also a very like scary and kind of anxiety producing part of the process for a lot of writers, because this is something that is your sort of creative baby that you've been working on, maybe with, on your own or with a few, sort of trusted people for many years, and then you're kind of handing it over to a marketing and publicity team. So I know that that can be, that's no small thing. So I always want to be, to honor that and to be as supportive and really be partners and teammates as much as we can. So yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I'll turn it back to you guys.
Thank you, Gwyneth. That's awesome. And I also I appreciate your sort of your perspective here, which I want to talk a lot about, sort of perspective in terms of, yeah, being a writer. Writing a manuscript is so different from promoting a book. And I think it's the part that, yeah, we're working to demystify here. And I think of our jobs as this intersection of art and marketplace, and we're at the middle of it. And so you guys are the artist, and we are trying to sort of demystify the marketplace and see how you can better function within that marketplace. Yeah. So Chantelle, tell us a little bit about what you do and sort of your career trajectory as well.
Sure. So again, my name is Chantelle. I am the Assistant Director of Marketing at Crown. So I work really closely with Libby and Gwyneth. And I work with both fiction and nonfiction now. I've been at Penguin Random House and Crown for a little over 3 years. Well, approaching 4 years in February. So that has been a wonderful experience. In terms of my history, I started out in publishing at Penguin right out of college in sales, but I knew I didn't want to do sales. But the brilliant part about sales was it really gave me an opportunity to kind of learn all the different departments in the business, because we were kind of interacting with everyone, specifically helping out indie field rep sales. So it was definitely still a very much positive experience. And then after that, I went to McGraw-Hill. So I dabbled in, college textbooks. And then I did some medical and scientific publishing, which was also quite interesting, but I couldn't quite wait to make my way back to traditional trade publishing. So that's kind of been my path in publishing. So I've been all around, but really largely focusing on marketing.
Awesome. And Whitney, tell us a little bit about your job.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm sorry. I feel like it looks like I'm calling in from a basement, but it's just all the sunlight has
I know.
I'm not used to having Zooms this late in the day, I guess. But I started right out of college, which was 1998, and started at Houghton Mifflin back when Houghton Mifflin existed. It sort of dissolved a few years ago, but and I was there for a few years, and I went to Norton, W.W. Norton for several years. I went back to Houghton, and I ended up my in-house career as the director of publicity at Public Affairs, which is this sort of wonky, pretty strictly nonfiction house, at least at the time, run by a former editor at the Washington Post. So I often say it was run more like a newsroom than a publisher, but it really gave me a lot of experience with a certain kind of hard-hitting nonfiction. And then I took a break. And when I started back up, I took independent work. I freelanced. I was hired by authors or hired by publishers, and it sort of organically grew into a business. And that's what I do now. I'm an independent publicist, and I work mostly on nonfiction. About 10 years ago, I formed a coalition with 2 other publicists, which has since grown, called Broadside PR. So that's where I am now. And the one project that I am really excited about that exposes me to a lot of fiction and poetry and drama writing, actually, is the work that my business partner, and I do with the Whiting Foundation. So other than that, I work on nonfiction, such as Elizabeth Kolbert's The Sixth Extinction. I worked on David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, as well as memoirs like Sophia Sinclair's memoir or Clint Smith's How the Word Is Passed. So sort of a mix of creative nonfiction and science and some history. So my path.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And I'll just say, in terms of geography, not that it matters because we're Zooming, but Whitney's in Philadelphia.
I'm here.
Chantelle's in Brooklyn or on vacation somewhere. No, Brooklyn. And Gwyneth is in Maine, Portland, Maine. So while, you know, publishing is still remains like very New York focused, you can still be a little far afield, which is pretty cool. And thank you guys for sharing the genres that you write in. A lot of fiction, narrative nonfiction, genre fiction, memoir, some history, historical fiction, very cool. The other sort of element I didn't mention today, but I mentioned previously, I'm also a published poet. I published a book of poetry with an independent press in Philadelphia, Saturnalia Books. So I have a little bit of insight into that process because poetry is a lot different than the other genres. So if people have questions about that at the end, happy to answer that as well too. Let's start simple, although this is a question that took me a while to figure out, even if I was working in publishing, and no one should be embarrassed to ask. And Chantelle, I'm going to make you answer it. I know that you can. What is the difference between marketing and publicity?
Sure. I would say the most obvious difference is that on the publicity side, I think it's a little easier to say what publicity is versus what marketing is.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah,
Also, marketing has grown, which is what we're going to talk about as well too. So
I think what we consider marketing has just kind of changed shape over the years as different technologies come and go. But we usually put the dividing line as in terms of like traditional media falls under publicity. So when you're thinking about news, radio, TV, events, some events, not all, but some events, we would consider that publicity, as well as podcasts. On the marketing side, we're more thinking about positioning and really trying to figure out who the best reader is and how to reach that reader. So we're thinking about social media, advertising, paid advertising, as well as just kind of organic promotion efforts across the web. We're talking about outreach to organizations, groups, anyone that's really in alignment with your book and its topic would fall under marketing. We also work really closely with sales, so we want to make sure the book is also being marketed to sales as well, so not just to readers. So that's kind of where the line between publicity and marketing is. And whenever there's a crossover, we work so closely, so there's never really an issue. But yeah.
I know it's a funny distinction, right? Because it's like walking around the regular world as a creator or an artist, like you don't need to know that distinction, but like working in media, it's blurred. The lines are blurred, but they're still sort of different roles that take versus like what always sort of helps me clarify it is this idea of like publicity as like earned media, which is like someone somewhere has to like make a decision to write about the book, right? Or to podcast about the book, or sort of like, you know, have you on the Today Show and sort of like that distinction. But again, the lines are kind of blurring in a lot of ways. Gwyneth, a question for you. When do you usually enter the sort of like life of the book? Like when do you sort of come in, like when does your role start?
It's usually probably around 6 months before publication. There's always exceptions to that. You know, and I didn't say actually genres I work on, but it's mostly nonfiction as well, though I do some fiction too. And I'm excited that I get to do a little bit more now. But especially, you know, there might be a book with, say, you know, somebody who's like a really sort of public figure where it's a rushed schedule and I don't work with them until 3 or 4 months before the release. But typically about 6 months is kind of the standard.
And is it and the book is done by that point, right? Like it's written. Yeah.
Yes. Ideally, yes, it's all done. So
sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not exactly.
Or sometimes it's still in process, like it's mostly done, but there's still those things that have to be fine-tuned. And that is an important thing. I mean, I feel like just when I'm talking to non-publishing people or, you know, just like kind of out in the world, people ask me about my job. One of the questions I always get is, do you read the books you work on? And my answer is always yes. And it's because, you know, like you have to, if you want to do a good job, like you have to know what the book is, you know, and because we're all here because we're book people anyway. So having a manuscript that you can read is really important for publicists and marketers because we want to know your book inside and out. maybe not on the line by line level that like your editor does, but at least be able to talk about it in an informed way and in a creative way, thinking about like the themes or, you know, like what happens in it, or, you know, just your reactions to it and the reactions that a reader might have. Yeah, so it's really good to be able to actually have the whole thing to deal with.
Yeah. Whitney, is your timeline a little different because you sort of work independently, and sort of like when do you come into the process with authors?
Yeah, I mean, we sometimes are approached by authors more like 6 months in advance, but a lot of the time it's like a year in advance or 9 months in advance. And, you know, so much of the work can't begin until you have this advanced reading copy or like a clean PDF that we can share with the media.
Wait, I'm gonna stop you there, and I will stop any of you guys if we have jargon, which is to say, what is an advanced reading copy?
So it's just a version of the book that may still have like a couple typos in it, hopefully not, but that the publicists need to use like months and months in advance, ideally like 6 to 8 months in advance, to send out to book review editors, to send out to freelance reviewers, to send out to, you know, NPR producers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think these days, especially after COVID, a lot of people are willing to read stuff electronically. So publicists are using PDFs of the manuscript, or using, you know, these platforms that deliver sort of an e-galley or an e-advanced reading copy instead of the physical thing. But a lot of people still just want to read a galley. So yeah. So, but in terms of my timeline, I will just say that I do think that one of the most important parts of our job is getting the sense of like how to talk about a book down. And it's nice to have a little extra time to do that. So that a lot of the time, that's what I'm working on before those advanced reading copies are ready.
That's interesting, this idea of like talking about a book, like, because essentially you kind of do have to boil down a book to an elevator pitch, which is a lot of you all's jobs, is like, how do we, this big thing that's like anywhere from like usually, you know, 200 to 400, 500 pages. How do you sort of be able to sort of say what that is very quickly or visually, or sort of use language to catch people's attention that way? Chantelle, a question for you. What do you wish more authors knew before you started working with them? Like, if there were certain sort of like elements of how book marketing works that you wish that all authors sort of like knew coming into the game, like what are some of those things?
I would say one is that, you know, having a network is just really important nowadays in terms of book marketing. So, you know, waiting until your book comes out to start your social media is probably not the best idea. And I won't say that, you know, every book absolutely needs it, but if it is a goal of yours and if it is something you want to do, you know, you can never be too early in terms of establishing yourself online. And then the other is that, you know, we can't make you go viral. We do find authors that just kind of want to go viral and just think that any kind of quirky idea will go viral. And I'm like, no, the internet's a really organic place. And, you know, making those connections across the internet is more important than trying to like manufacture a moment.
Totally. We talked the first week a lot about, when we talked about platform, we talked about like network, like what does that mean? And it can mean a lot of things, right? Like it can mean sort of like you're very famous, you have an audience, like you're speaking to them, but like maybe you write a Substack that like you have a very, you know, dedicated subscriber base. Maybe you have a small podcast, again, that people are tuning in to listen to. Maybe you were just very connected and AKA friends with lots of people sort of in the book world. And sort of making those connections is crucial to, yeah, helping your book get out into the world. So yeah, would you say that sort of those networks can take different forms?
Definitely. I've definitely seen some authors who may have very moderate or small socials, but have huge connections in the book world. They're out there like meeting other authors all the time, and it really pays off when it's time for their book to come out, and they're getting, you know, assistance on social. Their author friends are posting it. They're getting invitations to like, you know, special kind of niche events and things of that sort. So your network can look really different. So when we do talk about networks and, you know, being well connected, we don't want to exclude anyone that doesn't have a huge social. That can mean newsletters, Substacks. I think Substacks we're seeing really blowing up in terms of popularity. So when authors are doing this kind of on their own before the book, and if they just have something to say generally, that is becoming a really useful tool. I think email, has come and gone and came back again in terms of how useful it is as a marketing tool.
Yeah, I definitely like co-sign that. Gwyneth, how do you think the sort of media landscape has changed or evolved, like since you've been doing this work? Just you could talk for an hour about that, but
I'm sure I
in
could.
a
It's
nutshell.
changed a lot.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's changed a lot, and I'm sure Whitney has a perspective on this too. Like, it's changed a lot. Even in I've been in book publicity now for, I guess, coming up on 15 years. And when I was starting out, there was still like the kind of landscape at the time. Like there were more book reviewers and book review sections like at regular newspapers. So, like where I live here in Portland, Maine, like the Portland Press Herald, like they ran book reviews. A lot of sort of like smaller and like more kind of regional newspapers across the country. That was still a thing. And like the Alt Weekly, sort of like the Village Voice, and like there were those types of papers in every major city. Those have dwindled. This is something that's happened just over the last 10 or 15 years, that there's just fewer and fewer of those kinds of like local and regional media outlets. And the ones that are still there are doing less like books specific coverage or like art specific coverage. So that's one thing that's changed a lot. On the flip side, like podcasts were really not a thing when I was starting out. Audiobooks this is not really publicity exactly, but audio was like a kind of a niche part of the business. It was mostly books on tape, and it was like a pretty like niche group of people who were purchasing like books on tape or books on CD or whatever. And now like so many people love audiobooks, and podcasts were a big part of that. So I think that's one of the biggest pieces of it. One of the biggest challenges I've seen with some of those changes is that like every writer and editor and producer who I'm pitching has a lot of other things that they're responsible for, and they're receiving a lot of like those kinds of story ideas and pitches from a million directions. So it is difficult in the same way that like we all just as individuals may feel like our attention is pulled in all these different ways, and we have a lot of information overload with like what we're seeing online and the news we're following or whatever. Like, so, people feel like that within the media too. So it can be a challenge sometimes just to kind of like have that one-on-one conversation, or get somebody to, to read your email over somebody else's, or to read the book after seeing your email or whatever it is. And and for that to be happening kind of proactively too. Like I think there was maybe a time when, like, for example, with NPR, I could like they had this kind of internal like dib system where the different shows, would say they coordinated with one another, and Morning Edition would say, "Oh, I really want to interview this author," and they would come to us, and didn't need to be a famous author or like a really hot topic. It was just that they were excited that this book was being published. Sort of saw their duty as like covering what was happening in the books world. And I think that has kind of diminished over time. Like now that still does happen sometimes, but it's rarer and rarer. It's really, I think our jobs have actually become more about kind of plugging into other cultural things and like what's happening in the news, rather than like the book itself being a kind of a moment. That those are just fewer and farther between. Like those are the really established authors or a famous figure who is really making a splash with their book, or every once in a while there's a book from somebody we don't really know that like does kind of break through that, but those are the exception.
Yeah, I think that sort of like distinction of like the media used to come to books, and now the books have to go to the media.
Yeah.
Like that's real. Yeah. Whitney, do you have anything like to sort of like add to that about like, I don't know, surprising about ways that it's evolved, and maybe anything positive?
Yeah, I'll say a positive. No, I mean, I definitely second everything that was just said. And I do think podcasts are great because of course, there are the Ezra Kleins and the, like the really big ones that are very competitive. But like if there's sort of a niche topic you're writing about or audience, I think it's kind of exciting because you can like research it and find, 10 podcasts they might be modest followings, but really loyal followings. And a lot of the time I find them like easier to sort of reach and find the right person.
Yeah.
So that's a positive. And I will also say that like the number of people on staff at so many of these places has dwindled, if not disappeared. I mean, the Philly Inquirer used to have a great book guy, John Timpane. He was awesome. And when he left, they didn't really replace them. Sometimes there's book coverage, but it's not sort of a regular thing. But the book coverage that they have run has been like a freelance writer here or there. So I find that our relationships with the freelance writers are just as important as our relationships with the on-staff editors. So what that means for you is, and I know this isn't rocket science, but I think, my first boss in publishing said, like, be a byline junkie, like really pay attention to who's writing about books and the kind of books you're writing, you're working on, and for what outlets, and see who's reviewing books like what you're working on, see what shows are having guests on, like, that's sort of in line with what you're writing about. And then I really find that because everybody's so overloaded, this is not a magic bullet, but personal notes from writers can make a difference. I worked on a book this fall by a debut writer, Aaron Robertson, a book about Black Utopia. And he just like really loved certain podcast hosts or certain contributing writers to different magazines. And he would write really thoughtful notes to those people. And I do think it made a difference. It doesn't always mean that they're going to book it or write about it, but we all need some personal attention these days.
And to be complimented for our work by someone who enjoys it.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Chantelle, I have a question for you on the fiction side, which I know, so at our imprint Crown, we predominantly did nonfiction for a long time, and now we're doing fiction again. And when you were sort of starting, when you like start with a novel, like sort of like what are the levers of marketing that you're going to try to pull with that novel? Like, and granted, I'm sure it depends on the novel in a lot of ways, but like, is there a baseline? Like, how do you even like sort of like start that campaign?
I would say fiction is a little trickier than nonfiction because it's like, with nonfiction, you're kind of falling into very specific buckets. You could be a memoir, you could be history, you can be political, and you kind of just have your people that, oh, they'll like this, they'll like that. Fiction can be a little bit more difficult because fiction is just so broad. Of course, you're going to have like, your romance or some of the kind of more traditional or types of fiction where, you don't need to do a lot of work with those titles because people are reading 4 romance books in a week. But if it's like a literary fiction title or a debut author and it's just more of a classic novel, it can be really difficult to kind of break through the noise and get them, get people just to simply open the book and read the book. So I would say we really try to nail down like the comps. And I know sometimes that seems like a dirty word sometimes. But
I'm going to stop you there. We got jargon alert. Oh my God. What if I had a little icon that said jargon alert? I'd be so excited. What is a comp?
So a comp is a title, and I mean, I guess editorial uses comps, sales uses comps, and marketing uses comps, but I think we all kind of use them in similar but different ways. So on the marketing side, when we see a comp, we're like, oh, okay, this reader might like this kind of book. So we'll kind of, think about that book, and we'll kind of let that audience frame how we're going to market the new book. So it's really important to have these comps because, especially for debut authors, because we have nothing to compare it to. So it's an unfair comparison in many ways, but still kind of a necessary comparison. So it's like a necessary evil, but it's really helpful, at least to get the conversation started, especially from the marketing perspective. but also from the sales perspective, you know, we do need to read all these books, but you know, we're just one imprint at Crown, whereas a sales team might be selling, you know, 10 imprints. So it's very important to have these kind of quick snapshot views of something to help kind of at least start the early positioning. And then the more we're dealing with the book, the longer we're working on a campaign, we can really hone in on that audience.
Awesome. I'm going to ask you one other, I don't know if this is a jargon alert, but I will ask you to define it because I need to know more about it too. What is positioning?
Okay, so positioning is just kind of understanding, I guess it's similar to comps, but it's just kind of like understanding the book and who the book is for, what kind of reader would be drawn to the book. Is it for women who are like in business? Is it for personal finance? If they like this book, would this be of interest? So kind of figuring out who that main group is of audience and then the subgroup around it, so that we know when we are having those conversations, we need to be able to explain it. It's kind of like the elevator pitch. Positioning is kind of the elevator pitch. We need to be able to explain really quickly what this book is about and who it's for.
That makes total sense. And this all kind of goes back to things that we talked the last previous weeks about sort of like informing yourself as a writer, the books that your book is going to be in conversation with, the book that you are going to be shelved next to, and also just, and this goes from comps extend all the way to, I think it should extend when if you want to sell a book and you want it to, you know, be commercially successful when you're creating it in certain ways. But then also when you're querying agents, right? And sort of you put a synopsis of the book, but then in that letter, that initial letter, but you also say, this is for readers of XYZ. And that's the first place where you're formally sort of comparing your book, putting it in this sort of like lineage of other books. We could do a whole panel about comps because they are complicated, no pun intended, and also a little like problematic in certain ways because, you know, only certain identities of people have traditionally mostly been published. And so if these are the kind of books that have been published, how are we going to get other books by other people with other perspectives in the pipeline? And that's something that we're talking about at Penguin Random House right now. But nonetheless, selling books and putting books into the world is always relating a book to another book. And I think once you sort of understand that, and which again comes back to sort of your art entering the marketplace, right? So how is it going to be in conversation with these other items that exist in this marketplace? I think it's critical to all of that. And I had a great question for Gwyneth and it just ran out of my brain. So I'm going to talk through it for 1 minute. Oh yeah, here it is. What happens when the publisher, and the publisher being like maybe the editor, the publicist, and the marketer, have a sort of different perception of how the book should be positioned or sort of described? How do you sort of, what if you're in conflict about those ideas and how do you work that through?
That is a great question.
It's a
And
tough
I
one.
know that this has happened before, but I can't, like, my mind has gone blank of like examples of this recently, but
Well, I can
think
open it to Chantelle and Whitney too, if you guys have any examples of, because that's a challenge, right? Like someone's written a beautiful 300-page novel or treatise on like whatever, and then you're like, we're turning it into 2 sentences. And
Yeah.
it's really hard to do that and to also like treat that art with the respect and reverence it deserves. And yet it's our job to sell it. And so, you know, people have no attention span. And so we kind of need to, well, then I'll say for you then, what are strategies? Like, what are your strategies to like boil down that pitch or that positioning? Like, how do you kind of get there?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what you're getting at, or like what I'm kind of picking up in this question is the personal sort of relationship to the book, because like we're, you know, everybody who works in this business is like just, you know, also just a human with like their own taste and their own perspective and, you know, subjectivity and all of that. So my read of a book is going to be different from yours or Chantelle's. And so, you know, that's part of what we try to do is like find what are the common threads and the places where you know, we're all kind of, maybe we all really love the book, but for slightly different reasons. And so we can talk about that and use those reasons to then go out and find readers and maybe kind of like to borrow some marketing kind of, ideas, like you're kind of testing like different messaging, or, this kind of message might work with one audience, or one type of media or a writer or whoever, but it's going to work in a different way somewhere else. So when I'm kind of starting out thinking about that audience and the media that I'm going to go after, I'm usually looking at kind of like the big picture first, of like, at the core, like kind of what is this book, and what do we think is probably the most interesting for people to get them to want to read it. But then we're also going to have a little bit of like a tree of other, like sub reasons and other like tangents and stuff. I feel like I'm making this sound more complicated than it is, but it's just like the same way that you would love a book and or a TV show or something. It's like, yeah, there's something here that's for people who love, kind of like sci-fi, but there's also like a human, like maybe there's a romance. And so there's other people who are going to come to it for that. Or there's people who are looking at it from like, I don't know, like a political kind of like social perspective of like, where are we going as a society? Like, so I think you're kind of looking at the overlapping themes, and then kind of trying to match make a little bit of between a reader and some of these different parts of the book.
No, I think that's spot on. Like, it is matchmaking in certain ways. And I think also from that, there has to be a bit of distance at one point, like from the book itself, for the author to have from the book, and sort of because it's now become this sort of like commodity in certain ways, like that will impact people in different ways. And you don't have control over that as the author. And like, you may think of your book in one specific way and hope it does one specific thing. And it might do that for some people, but it might do a whole host of other things. So I think letting go in a little bit of sort of how you conceive of a book, while also standing true to sort of what you wanted it to achieve and how you want it to be described. It's a balance, and it's all done in conversation. But that's why you kind of describe that process. It's a process that happens in-house. When we talk about books, it also happens between author and editor. As we edit and like create the book, to say like, what does this book do and who is it for? But it's definitely complicated in a lot of ways when you enter that marketplace. Whitney, like, yeah, do you ever sort of like adjust your messaging as you go then in process, like with feedback from media? Yeah. Tell me about that.
I mean, as the news cycle changes, or as you find that certain things are working when you're talking to people and certain things aren't. And I, just to add quickly to what you just said, I think the question of why now too is important for a lot of nonfiction. Or like, what makes your book unique? I mean, just to sort of be able to like weave an answer to that question into your sort of elevator pitch for the book can be really helpful for certain kinds of nonfiction. But I mean, it's your message changes all the time. And I often say this to writers too, like, I think there are so many opportunities in an author's experience with one work to talk about it. And I think a lot of us get trapped in writing about it. And so there's a certain way we write about it. But then when your publicist is on a call with the media, or when you're talking to your friend about the book you're writing, you're going to describe it in a very different way or a different style. And so I always tell people, like, practice on your partner, friend, roommate a bunch of times, like, just see what sticks, like, see what works for people. And you're going to be doing the same thing as you're writing about your work. But I mean, I'm trying to think of a specific example, but it just happens all the time. It happens all the time. Things get changed.
And can I add something too? I think one of the things that I love and find really helpful is, I find this happens a lot, like when I'm having a conversation with the author, especially like early on in that process. And sometimes we'll have a specific reason to, or we'll just do on our own, like a little sample, like Q&A kind of thing. And it's usually really helpful to hear the author talking about their book and some of these questions: why you wrote it, what inspired it, like what do you hope readers take away from it. And that can give us more kind of like more ideas, more ammunition of like, oh, how this is going to connect with somebody else. And I love that point too of like, I have to do that myself all the time of like, oh, I'm going to write my like pitch and it's all formal and it has to like match the, the copy that the author and editor have put together. But versus if I'm just telling my friend about this great book I read, I'm going to use different language. And anyway, I co-sign. That's a great exercise.
I do that with my authors all the time, which I'm like, just tell me the thing. Like, not even in sort of, any marketing or publicity context, but just if you're trying to get an idea across and it feels muddy on the page in any way, I'm like, okay, don't look at the page, just tell it to me. And like, literally 9 times out of 10, I'm like, write that down. You just said the thing. I think we in publishing tend to, sort of, what is the word? It's been a long day, but sort of lift up the written word in certain ways. But the spoken word and sort of the way that we just express our ideas simply through dialogue and conversation is often the most direct and therefore the most effective. So I co-sign that as well too. If you're stuck in any sort of idea, like generation ever, or just getting a point across, just say the damn thing and like maybe record yourself on voice memo if you're not too embarrassed and listen to it, because it could get you really far. So I'm going to ask you guys the same question and about what brings you joy in this job and this process, and during that time, if you guys in the audience, if you have questions, you want to start throwing some questions in the chat, now would be a great time. I also want to sort of just make the observation that so much of what we're talking about today, I think, relates to writing a pitch letter to an agent, pitching yourself on manuscript wish list, or just sort of like putting your writing forward in any way. Like these are all, that's going to be a process. As soon as you have the writing and you know it's ready to go into the world, you are going to be doing again and again and again till your eyes fall out. But if you believe in the work, it's joyful. And also, we just want to give you the tools to talk about those things and to sort of do that all more effectively. So to that end, Chantelle, what brings you joy in your job, or what's something that has brought you joy in your job recently?
I would say just seeing a project to completion. And, completion looks different for every book because some books have really long tails. Some books are books of the moment, but just kind of, getting that manuscript on your desk and saying, all right, this is my book. I'm going to work on this book. And, just seeing that through and trying new things. I think that's the biggest one. We don't have the bandwidth to do everything for every book, but when we do have those pockets of time where we can really explore and try new ideas, I think that's really helpful. Even the ones that don't necessarily work or didn't move the needle, I should say, because they really haven't been bad experiences. It's just some will move the needle more than others, and some things just aren't trackable. So it doesn't mean that it wasn't worthwhile. It just meant we couldn't track it. So I think really having that extra time to kind of think outside the box and try new things is what brings me joy in this role.
I love that. I love that, trying new things. Yeah, when we get to do that from an editor's perspective, we are thrilled as well. Gwyneth, what brings you joy in your job, or something that brought you joy recently?
The first thing that came to mind is awards, which, it's so, I feel like I should be giving everybody advice that's like, don't like set your value on, whatever, don't like tie the value of your work to like these external things. But it's really nice to be recognized. And yeah, we had a book that was a finalist for the National Book Awards, which was last night. And just being in communication with the author about that and like seeing her excitement over that was like just so rewarding. So I love when that happens. And even books that, so like, for example, in a previous iteration of Penguin Random House, I worked with Hogarth, and Chantelle did too. And we got to work with Hong Kong, and I love her work. And I'm not working with her right now, but she just won the Nobel Prize. So I was like, even though I'm not even involved at all, it was like, I just feel this love towards her and her work. And I'm so glad that it's being recognized on this global scale. So that's something that has brought me joy recently. And I will also say, a lot of us are in this, because we like working with writers too, and the personal sort of relational, like, pieces of it. And so it's just always a joy when you really like have that, where you like vibe with someone and you enjoy working with them. And it's not just, it's not just about did we get the interview or the review or whatever, but like you feel like you're on the same team and you're a part of something bigger. So those are the kinds of things that bring me joy.
That's awesome. I just have to mention this because it combines both of your joys, which you're talking about this book by Kate Mann, right? That was a Crown book that was shortlisted, whatever, for the National Book Awards. I remember, and this brings in Chantelle's point about seeing something like full circle. I remember when that book was in on submission, which that means that we are considering like a short version of the book that's being pitched from the agent, and we are all sort of deciding if we want to publish it. I wasn't the editor, but I got to read that, and I love her work, and I advocated for that book, and I thought it was amazing that because the book is basically about sort of fat phobia and how that is like, being anti-fat is kind of like the next just the place where we need to sort of seek equality. But to see that go from like, it was a 50-page proposal to like a book that's now, a finalist for the National Book Award. How wild. What a privilege. Like, not even my book, but just my team. It's really cool. It makes it all worth it. Whitney, what is bringing you joy or brings you joy or has recently brought you joy?
I would say that, I mean, I think some of what Gwyneth just said rings true to me too. I mean, some of like the most meaningful moments in my career have been just being able to spend time with some of these writers and like, I mean, I can think of a few examples of just being in the room when they're being interviewed and getting to hear these incredible thinkers, answer someone's question on the spot. And I don't know, it can be really moving and feel just special to have that access. But honestly, the other kind of joy is when an author is a really good literary citizen, just meaning that they like, well before their own book or books come out, like they champion other people's work on social media, they review other books, they serve as interlocutors at events at the local bookstore, they know their local booksellers, and these are probably all things that you've heard about in previous panels. But and then to see when their book comes out, just like the love the love coming back to them, it's really special. And it's again a reminder that it does make a difference, like how you treat the people in your industry and in your field and in that literary world. I think if you like plant those seeds, and I don't mean for it to sound so calculating, but if you're if you care about it and you are going to champion other people, like I think it will come back to you in a number of ways. And I think the authors who really appreciate, even if it's a seemingly small thing, like a website, again, with a modest following, but a really dedicated following, and they get a beautiful review. Like when people really appreciate that, I don't know, it like restores my faith in humanity.
I know it. No, and I think that totally connects to this idea of like a network too, like networking, like, oh, sounds icky, but like it's authentic if it's other writers and creators that you love.
Yeah.
Like, and what a joy to be in community with other people whom you enjoy their work and you want to share more work with them. So I want to sort of like take the ickiness out of networking and sort of just think of it as like community building, which is what we're doing here and what Blue Stoop is doing really well too. So it takes many forms. All right. Questions. You guys have some good ones. And I think several people have this one, but Samantha Stein says, how are you? And I think she means the marketers and which I will refer this to Chantelle and Gwyneth as like the in-house marketers and publicists. How are you selected for a book? Does the publisher make a choice? And what do you read before you agree to work on it? That might be a Whitney question, but yeah, Gwyneth and Chantelle, how does that get figured out? Like who's going to publicize or market a book?
Yeah, I mean, so whenever the editors launch, or I think different publishers have different words for these, like
jargon
parts of the
alert. Tell us
process.
about a launch.
But basically, the launch at PRH is where editors present to sales, marketing, publicity, a lot, and all of the other departments. Here's the books that we're publishing in fall 2025. And so we we hear about those at that point, there might not be a full manuscript yet, but the editor is giving sort of a short presentation on what the book is and what it will be and all of that. So we're listening for what excites us. And most places, I mean, certainly at Crown and other places I've worked, we kind of have like a wish list that we'll put together and say, oh, I really love this author's work, or I'm really interested in this topic. Maybe I have certain experience to bring to that topic. Like, yeah, this reminded me of, like this book is about, I don't know, for example, there's a book coming out that's all about a wolf. And I'm like, oh, we had this other book about a wolf a few years ago. And like, here's some other ideas from it. Or a book I'm working on with Libby, which is all about a woman who becomes an Episcopal nun. And I'm like, I'm Episcopalian. And also, I really love her like views on everything. She's so cool. So I have like maybe, and I have friends who, whatever, I have like specific knowledge to bring to the table that might be personal, or it might just be professional, like just experience you've had. So we kind of put in our wish list, and then the marketing publicity directors will then assign, well, I assume it's similar marketing. I'll let Chantelle speak to that, but the publicity director will then assign it. And there's a lot of other factors beyond your wish list. So there's always things that like, oh, I loved it, but I didn't get a chance to work on it. Or there's things that like, it didn't actually stand out to me on a personal level, but there's a reason why my boss wants me to work on it. And so we'll talk that through, and then it kind of goes from there. And there are cases, I think, where, sometimes things will change based on like an author's, sort of viewpoint or something. But most of the time it's a mix of things you really want to work on, and also things that maybe weren't, 100% like your first choice, but at the same time, like we're all professionals and we'll do a great job on it.
Yeah, I would say the process is pretty much the same on the marketing side. There's a lot of different factors, but we also submit a wish list once we've viewed all the books presented. And there's just a lot of factors. If it's a repeat author and you've worked with their books before, it's nice to have continuity and keep you on their future book. That's just really a positive experience for the author as well. Because there's a lot of information and detail you might have from working with them that you will bring over. That's a lot easier for you to stay on that campaign versus kind of onboarding someone new. But yeah, I would agree, just different factors in your life, your interests, your experience, and your workload.
Yeah, that's real. Whitney, I have a question here, a great question on Clint Smith's How the World is Past. It's a very genre mashing work. I agree with that. It's doing a lot of things there. That did very well, so critically and financially. Jason wants to hear how that book was specifically promoted, which probably don't have time for all of that, but that was probably, I mean, tough to promote in a lot of ways, but maybe not so much because Clint had a real following. But were there any sort of like surprising elements of that campaign, or just places that you think it really readers connected with it?
Well, I will say that's a perfect example of good literary citizen. Like he had a network. Like, I mean, people love him like for who he is beyond his writing, but he was a poet first, as most people probably know. When we started working with him, like that's when he got the a gig at the Atlantic. So like that book launched with an excerpt in the Atlantic. And there was we had a lot of great footage of Clint to work with, like of either snippets of interviews that he'd done, or like maybe like a snippet from a talk that we could use to show broadcast media how great he was,
Actually, I want to stop you there because I feel like that's something that's come up with many of my authors recently, right? Like maybe you're an expert in a certain arena and you've written a book about that, but like you haven't necessarily been on media. And yet we, publicists and marketers, are then trying to like get you on media. Those clips from either like speaking events or even just like recordings of you very compellingly talking about your book can be powerful, right?
Yes, it's so important. I mean, again, it's not always a magic bullet, but if you have a really short, like just fantastic clip of you talking about something, it actually doesn't have to be about your book. It can just be something that just shows a producer like, oh, this person, he knows or she knows how to like speak, quickly, how to answer questions, go in different directions. be animated, be dynamic on the air. Like, it's really important. And so, yeah, having some sort of clip, even if like someone films you, it's got to be good quality, but it can be from anything.
Yeah, I think and that even just kind of speaks a little bit more to like public speaking broadly, which is to say, yeah, if you're ready to like put your book into the world, you got to get ready to talk about it yourself. Really quickly, because we only have like 2 minutes left. Gwyneth, talk briefly about media trading and like what that means for authors.
Yeah, so to that point of talking about your work, we will do that, like on a, I don't know, sort of a tailored basis, like depending on the book and the author that we're working with. Some authors we work with have a lot of experience, like being on a radio show or a TV show. A lot have zero experience with it. So like I was talking about with doing sort of like a little, sort of sample Q&A, we'll do that and it'll be me and maybe your editor or maybe the marketer, a couple small people, couple people from the team just on the phone on Zoom with you talking through some questions that you're likely to get in an upcoming interview. Sometimes we'll do this sort of like way in advance, like it's not even a specific interview in mind, but it's just kind of to get you comfortable talking about the book and to help nail down some of those answers where it's like you have all the information and the insight there, but you just need a little bit of feedback and coaching to kind of like get it to a succinct, clear, few sentences that gets across the point that you want to get across. Because like public speaking is such a big fear. So many people obviously have, and it can be really easy to kind of just have the emotions flood you, and then you're like, you don't really know what you're saying. So we really want to be a resource for you in that process and kind of like fine tuning how you're talking about the book. Because at the end of the day, that's also then going to help people who are hearing that interview or seeing that interview connect and want to get the book.
Totally. I mean, listen, I would like advocate for getting comfortable with public speaking for anyone who wants to be a professional writer or like write a book. Also, just because there's so much more joy in it. You can tell when someone who's like doing a reading at a bookstore or being interviewed on NPR or being interviewed on a TV show, like you can tell when they're enjoying it. It's a great opportunity to talk about your work. So practice and also just sort of, sort of dialing into why you wrote that book and why you want to spread the message of it, I think can be really powerful. So it's 5 p.m. I have to run. You all have to run. But I want to just say briefly, thank you all. Thank you for all, first my wonderful panelists, Whitney, Chantelle, and Gwyneth. You guys are amazing. And thank you everyone who like dialed in today and the last 3 weeks. This has been awesome. And the questions have been like so high level. I hope we helped, and I hope we help you sort of like conceptualize what this crazy book publishing industry is like. And I will make one last pitch, but maybe it's Julian will make it as well too, which is you have any spare money supporting organizations like Blue Stoop that do this work to create literary community, which is the only way we can kind of move forward in this world. Please do it. Please donate because they're doing great work. So Julian, you can say it too.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that shout out and preempting a very important talking point. This was such a great panel. I learned a lot. I hope you all did too. I'll check the chat later to see if I can gather up some questions and see if we can track down some answers for anything we didn't get to. And so I'm about to post some links in the chat. You can take a feedback survey to let us know how this went for you and what we can change and improve in the future. Fall classes, we've got one more, December 10th, and it is it's a creative approach to writing the self. I can't remember the exact class title, but it's good and you should sign up for it. And there's financial aid available. So give no excuse, check it out. And then upcoming events, we're skipping this Thursday session next week, but the week after, I think it's December 5th, we'll be back to our usually scheduled programming of community-led workshops, free, virtual, very cool. The next one is all about daughterhood in a very, kind of a complex and nuanced approach. So check that out if that's of interest. And the week after that, we'll have a great thing about good intro paragraphs with someone I'm very excited with. And then last but not least, the newsletter, stay in touch with us. And send us money. You don't have to.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just grateful that you're here, but if you're in a place in your life where you can share a little bit, we'd be very grateful. So with that, I'll stop my rambling. Thank you for being here. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Julian.
Thanks,
Thank you, wonderful
everyone.
panelists and audience. Bye, guys.
Thank you.